Welcome to Facing the Canon. My guest on the program is J.John, clinical neuropsychologist, speaker and author. Jo, welcome to Facing the Canon.
Thank you so much, J.John.
You are a clinical neuropsychologist.
I am, yes.
What does that mean?
Well, so I trained as a clinical psychologist.
Yes.
And essentially I specialised in working with conditions that go on in the brain. So my key areas of specialism have been brain injury and multiple sclerosis, really.
And you've written about this to help children understand a bit more about it.
Yeah, for sure. So in my early practice, I always felt quite sorry for the children. You know, one minute they're living with dad who's regular and like the rest of us, and then 2 weeks later he's had a stroke, can't speak, and maybe behaves very differently. And it struck me that there was nothing for children, and often even professionals didn't speak to the kids about what had happened. So yeah, I think my earliest publication, which I self-published, was a book called My Parent Has a Brain Injury. So yeah, that was my introduction into writing.
And I mean, writing that must have been quite challenging, even if you knew the information, to actually convey it in a way that children could eventually be helped.
I think the gift that God gave me was being born and raised into what we used to call a council house background, and then ending up in a Cambridge career.
Yes.
And for many years, I felt very uncomfortable about that. I always felt like I was the one that was less clever and didn't know about politics, didn't know the big words. But I think the gift was I've always been good at communicating with the average person. So I think I was good at calling round orifices holes. And some of my colleagues found that very difficult if they'd been raised in different contexts, to actually speak to people in a way they understood. And I've always found that really easy. So, yeah.
Now, you've been a psychologist for how long?
Oh, my goodness. I qualified in 1992.
And you've been a Christian for how long?
I've been a Christian since the mid-80s,
yes.
I think. Yeah, it's been not a kind of continuous upward trajectory for sure,
yeah.
But I certainly made a commitment, in the early 80s.
So what have you learned as you look back over those years of studying psychology and also knowing the Lord and studying the Bible?
I think my main point would be, thankfully, God is writing the story.
So, isn't that encouraging?
Yeah, I think I made a commitment. I didn't know really what I was committing to. I said yes to Jesus. I went home and told my parents that I'd become a Christian. I didn't really know what that meant. And I went back into the world and couldn't really sustain the walk. Then met my husband. Wasn't my husband then. He was a proper wrong-un. And I was very pulled by what was going on in the world. But God had it in hand, and eventually he became a Christian in a really dramatic way. And the same with my psychology, really. I went into psychology because I did a year's placement at Broadmoor Special Hospital, where Ron Cray and Peter Sutcliffe were then. So that was all very exciting. But the most exciting thing was they had a 2-hour lunch break. They started at 10 and finished at 4. In a very rookie way, I applied for a clinical psychology course whilst not knowing what a clinical psychologist was. So went into the interview, very brazen, completely messed it up. answered very stupid questions, came out feeling quite ashamed and embarrassed. And on the table where people got their coffee on the way out when they hadn't got a place, there was a piece of paper that said Worthing Town in mental handicapped, as it was called then, which was the most unwanted field of psychology to work in with people with learning disabilities. And in Worthing, which was where everyone went to die, they were offering double the bursary for someone to work for 2 years for that department. So, again, God's story, I'd failed to get the £6,000 bursary. I walked out feeling embarrassed and like a real mess up, and there was an offer of a job in a place that no one else would want, but Worthing was my hometown. So I went for that job and got the sponsorship and got paid double the money. And I don't think I even thanked God. So yeah, I think the more I've understood the Bible, the more I realised that it's the answer. Who knew? So I think, yeah, I became a Christian and then went into psychology and then gradually realised all the problems people bring to me.
Yes.
God has the answer, because mostly it's about shame and everybody wants to do God's values. It's a very interesting thing to discover.
And what you mean by that is that they may not articulate it as that, but they actually do want values and principles.
They want to be good. I think, that's
They
very,
want to be good.
the current thing in psychology and in business is choose your values. And so I sit down and I help thousands of people choose their values, and they say they want to be kind and grateful and loving and generous and self-controlled. And,
so they don't put down, I want to be angry, I want to be violent, I want to be, they put the good qualities.
They put the good qualities, and everyone who comes to see me is often stuck. And whether it's stuck in a marriage that's going wrong, or stuck in addiction, or being unfaithful, no one comes in and says, I'm so glad I'm in this position. They say, I want to be good, and I'm not showing up. I'm showing up in a way I don't want to be showing up. So
you talk in your writings, Jo, about ACT, A-C-T.
Yeah.
What is that?
So that's acceptance and commitment therapy. Lots of people listening will have heard of CBT,
yes,
cognitive behavioural therapy. So all CBT means is what you think really impacts what you do. So ACT is one of the more recent versions of that. And the difference probably fundamentally is it starts with values. So you choose how you want to show up. And then ACT is about disentangling, hence the book, from your thoughts and feelings that stop you. So a good example might be, I've come here today, I really want to be here. It's in line with my values to speak to you, to speak about God. But anything important we do is going to come with difficult thoughts and feelings. So there's a bit of anxiety. There's thoughts that maybe I'll say stupid things. Maybe I'll make a fool of myself. So anything important we do will arouse difficult thoughts and feelings.
Sure.
So what ACT talks about is how do we manage those thoughts and feelings so we can pursue the values that are important, so I can do the thing.
So how do we do that? Jo, how do we manage those feelings? Because we all have them.
We massively have them. And a really important point is to realise that thoughts are different to feelings. So often when you ask somebody how they're feeling, they'll tell you a thought. So feelings are in our body and thoughts come as words in our mind. So that's the first thing to sort of help people differentiate.
So when we say to somebody, how are you feeling? they're expressing what's going on in here,
Often, not always.
but
So
frequently.
Frequently, you say, "How are you feeling?" I'll be like, "Wow, my wife has been playing up," or "I haven't got the promotion at work."
Yes.
So they're thoughts. So actually,
which is affecting their feelings.
It can be, or your feelings can impact your thoughts.
Yeah.
Because when we get big feelings, we're essentially flooding our body with adrenaline and cortisol. And what that does is makes the world feel dangerous and everybody feel like your enemies.
Right.
So, you have a feeling of anxiety, and then immediately my mind will tell me that you're out to get me. You're not being kind. You're not doing a nice interview. You're actually trying to trick me. Because when we get flooded with those chemicals, our spam filter goes off. So we start to listen to junk. And that's when we're very vulnerable to forgetting the truths of the Bible. That God says, I'm accepted and I'm secure. We start to believe I'm unsafe and you're not my friend, and other people are against us. So thoughts and feelings are a bit more of a muddle than perhaps CBT, I think, often talked about. Oh, I have a thought, I'm unsafe, then I feel anxious.
So Jo, how do we get the truths of the Bible into our heads and into our hearts?
Wow, primarily by reading it and talking to other people about it and really understanding the whole story of the Bible. I think often people take small bits, they quote it out of context, they sometimes weaponize it, whereas actually the whole story of the Bible is how God came looking for broken people.
Yes.
And here's the answer to our hurt and shame, and that Jesus came to cover us. And I think when we really don't internalize that, I have to cover myself. And so we can end up using some quite rookie fig leaves like self-protection or self-promotion. And they lead down all sorts of paths that are sinful or at least unhelpful.
Yeah, so we try and hide because we're feeling shame or guilt.
Yeah.
So how do we get the forgiveness and the cleansing and the healing of Jesus?
Well, we recognise that we're wrong uns.
Yes.
And that Jesus was the only right person. So he came and he lived God's values 100% of the time. And he always said, my will, not yours. Whereas we're very prone as humans to want our will, not God's, aren't we? So Jesus came to undo all of that so that if we trust in his death, then we're covered by his righteousness. And when God looks at us, he sees his son. So we don't have to impress other people, and we don't even have to impress God. Because when God looks at us, he sees his perfectly right son. So I think the more we can soothe ourselves with those truths, the more I can show up, I can tell you the truth, I can be emotionally honest, because I don't have to image myself anymore. I don't have to prove myself, because Jesus has proved himself.
He certainly has. Now, your new book, Jo, Disentangled, I read this in manuscript form, and I was blown away by it. And I really was, by its simplicity and so many truths, I think, articulated in a way that I could digest.
That's good news.
So, well, this is your new recent book. Tell us about it, and tell us, what do you mean by disentangled?
Okay. I think it's that thing of, as Christians, we want to show up for God. I think most of us really do. And the Spirit inside of us is urging us to do that. But we live in fallen bodies. And so our big problem is as I said earlier, if you want to do something important, whether it's in ministry or just help your neighbour, I mean, imagine that you are standing in a queue in a coffee shop and you've set out to be perfectly polite, and before you know it, I'm standing in the queue, I'm trying to be patient, and then my mind says, will that woman in front just get on with it? The older lady that's faffing about, and suddenly my mind is caught with sort of thoughts that aren't very nice. Get on with it, I'm more important than you, why don't you stay home when I'm in my lunch hour? Those sorts of things. Then I start feeling anxiety, jealousy, irritation, and before I know it, I'm entangled with those inner thoughts. I'm flat on my face, really. And we can very quickly think, oh gosh, I left the house wanting to image God well, and now I've been really rude and irritable and arrogant, often with the people we love most or our church family. So I guess Disentangled is about, how do I disentangle from a thought that says, I'm not good enough, I'm stupid, or you're not good enough and you're stupid. Those kind of self-harming or other harming thoughts that get in the way of us serving God, being emotionally honest. And how do we manage those big feelings that come up without our consent? So we've been wired in childhood, and I will feel feelings I don't want to feel. How do I manage that when I'm standing in church next to someone and I feel jealous? How do I manage that feeling so I don't say something spiteful?
So where did that thought of jealousy come from?
Well, I think we live in a fallen body and mind, don't we? And so often, who knows? I think people can have long arguments about, is that from Satan, or is that from my own fallen mind, or is it something I read on a notice board this morning? I think, we've been raised by fallen parents in a fallen world. So one way or another, we've got a lot of sinful thoughts and feelings that aren't God-honouring inside of us. And we need to learn to discern and disentangle.
Yes, and the scripture talks about taking your thought life captive.
It really does, although I think sometimes people have got really worried about that, almost to the point where you're not going to leave the house because every thought that comes up, you need to stop it and suppress it and distract yourself from it. I think if you look into that passage, Paul is talking more about, recognizing there's a battle going on, and we need to stop these saboteurs so that they don't gang up and take us over, rather than playing sort of whack-a-mole with every thought. Otherwise, I seriously wouldn't leave the house in the morning if we were doing that. But yeah, absolutely. We need to notice what's going on inside of us before it trips us up. And that's the big challenge.
And that is the big challenge, isn't it? Because
yeah.
if we don't notice it, it could trip us up.
It really could. And I think there's a massive lack of self-awareness for lots of different people. I think often people are running around like headless chickens. And a lot of the time, because we are so fallen, we get very caught up with imaging ourselves well. And so even things like praying, reading our Bible, speaking in church, we can be doing from the wrong heart posture. We can be doing it to prove ourselves and not Jesus, can't we? Or we can do it to run away from the judgment of others. But we can also run to other soothing behaviours if we feel bad about ourselves and we're not aware of that, or if we have difficult thoughts and feelings coming up that are driving us that we're not aware of. We can end up in some very dark corners.
So how do we know whether we're doing that, Jo?
Well, I think that, one of the first chapters in the book is about how do we start to notice that? How do we start to notice our inner life? Because whether you know it or not, how you show up is being driven from the inside. And Jesus talked a lot about that. He said, come on, we don't have to worry about washing our hands and what's going inside of us. We need to worry big time about what's coming out, because that's what defiles us. That's where sin becomes evident. So you might, people might be driven from a thought of, I'm not good enough. How's that going to show up? It will show up. If I'm trying to prove myself as better than you, I'll always be competing. I'll always be staying up for hours and hours, overworking or overstudying, just to make sure my Bible study's the best. Not to help other people in the room, but just to make you realize that you're not the best and I am. So again, if we don't know what's going on inside of us, it will show on the outside. So the first thing is to be noticing what's going on in the inside. And some people don't even know they've got thoughts and feelings. I've trained big groups of people, including professionals, police officers, and I've had people come up to me and say, I didn't know I had thoughts. So, that's
not
the first
aware of them at all.
No. How fortunate.
Obviously, the book is hopeful. It's not just diagnosis, it's remedy.
No, it's not at all diagnosis. No. It's about recognising we're all the same. So we've all got some really difficult thoughts and feelings going on. And I love what Graham Bainon says in the book Mirror, Mirror, which is like, you need a biblical self-image, which is we are all seriously messed up. But we are really loved. God knows us better than anyone. So I don't have to hide from him. And if he knows me most and still loves me, then why would I want to hide from you or anyone else? So it's first, let's put our biblical self-image on. And then how do we know what's going on inside and how that's showing up outside, so that we don't slip back into self-protection and self-promotion, kind of like fig leaves, instead of wearing Jesus. We're supposed to be in Christ, aren't we? So, it's very much about how do we manage our inner lives so we can show up to prove Jesus and not ourselves.
Wow. I mean, that's it at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's what we all want.
We want to be like Jesus.
We want to be like Jesus.
And so the question is, how can we be like Jesus?
Yeah.
And remove these obstacles?
Yeah. And not let Satan outwit us. Because I think our thoughts and feelings are often one of the key ways that Satan trips us up and takes us on the wrong path.
And Paul talks about how the sin so easily entangles us.
Absolutely,
Do you think we haven't been good at really looking into this?
I think we haven't, especially in the church.
Yeah.
I think sometimes, ideally, as people with a biblical self-image, we should be going to church, feeling comfortable in our most scruffy clothes, feeling, when you say to me on the door, how are you? It should be in church I feel most able to say, terrible. I've had a terrible week. I've really messed up. I've been rude. I've been obnoxious. I've been a rubbish mum and really upset my husband and mother. It should be in church, isn't it? Where we should be doing that.
But Jo, why is it that we feel we can't say that?
I think because we're not straight on the gospel sometimes. And maybe we need to feel more comfortable being vulnerable with each other, because God knows it, doesn't he? So we might be able to lick fancy to each other and cover up, but it's ridiculous, isn't it? Because Jesus sees right through us.
He does see right through us.
He knows what we're thinking and feeling. So if you ask me how I am and I say, amazing, Jesus knows that's not the truth. That's lying, isn't it? And it's interesting how, we're all big on if you ask somebody in church what are the 10 commandments, thou shalt not lie, probably would come out quite readily. And yet, when you ask me if I've had a good week and how I've shown up, people feel very able to lie. and be emotionally dishonest. So,
But do you think if you say, "Oh, I've had an awful week, my whole world is collapsing," people just wouldn't know what to say to you?
well, I think part of the book is actually learning. So the last chapter is racing with others, and how do we cope when someone cries? How do we cope when you say things that make me feel a bit helpless? Because again, that's self-awareness of, you burst into tears and say you've had a terrible week. That makes me feel helpless, makes me want to run away or say they're there or something else. So the book does go into how we can be better
Sure.
at that, because that's part of the problem. And I think if we can encourage each other to be more honest, that's a good starting point.
Joe, I love your honesty and I love your vulnerability. And you've also written these books, which are completely different, Surviving Him and Surviving Her. Now, what are these?
So they're psychological fiction.
How did you move from writing books like this to this? Or
Well, it was the other way round.
The other way round.
I think when I first became self-employed, I was really lonely. And I drove around the country seeing different people with different problems, and would try and read my book and just felt, there was too much going on. So I just sat down one day and started writing a story on my iPad. And that was my first novel. It just kind of went on and on and on. So, and really, people were encouraging and enjoyed it. So I've carried on doing that. So they're not Christian books.
They're not, but there are principles there.
Yeah, I think there's certainly nothing dishonouring to God in them. So there's no bad language, there's no blasphemy, sex or violence. But they're just psychological suspense that draw on, I suppose, principles about your inner life and neurological disease. They're the two things I guess I know most about. But I think there's a Bible verse in one of them, but that's it. The first one, Surviving Me, has the gospel entangled within it, but those two don't. So,
Well, Joe, you're obviously very creative, and it's wonderful how the Lord has gifted you and graced you with intelligence regarding psychology, but all of it is just permeates biblical truth. And I'd encourage anyone to read this. Joe, it's been a joy to have you on Facing the Canon. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
I hope that has inspired you. I hope you feel encouraged, and there's a lot there to chew over, and I will certainly be chewing over some of those things that Joe said. Thank you so much for joining us on Facing the Canon. Please join us again.